Hey everybody, this is section 2 of chapter 2 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's book, Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. The chapter 2 of part 1 is titled Logical, Historical, Dialectical, a departure from the methodological tradition and debates on the specificity of the Marxian method. There's two parts to part 2 of chapter 2, so I'm probably going to break it down even further into those small parts. Section 2 is titled Operative Dialectic, or Presentation and Contradictions, with the two headings Marxian Dialectic from the perspective of analytical positions and the peculiar logic of a peculiar object. Actually, it doesn't make sense to split them up in two because they're not the same, not even close to the same size. So actually, this will just be one video, Operative Dialectic or Presentation and Contradictions. It might be quite a long video, but that's just how the book is organized. Okay. So here we are. Operative Dialectic or Representation and Contradictions. The endeavor to formulate an emphatic dialectical concept of science, distinguished from, quote, positivism, can be found within Marxist discourse as early as the writings of Georg Lukács in the 1920s, and was subsequently pursued on a broad scale by the interdisciplinary materialism of critical theory of the Frankfurt School tradition. However, these approaches fail to offer a precise explication of their methodological terminology based on the actual procedure employed in Marx's critique of political economy, even though, as in the case of Horkheimer, Marx is explicitly credited with a foundational function regarding dialectical thought comparable to that of Descartes' Discourse on Method. Consequently, because they failed to investigate Marx's, quote, operative method, the actual mode of presentation found in Marx's Capital, these contributions need not concern us further here. By way of illustration, we shall mention at this juncture only certain aspects of Theodor W. Adorno's attempt to explicate the concept of a dialectical science, one that transcends critical rationalist positions. In doing so, it becomes evident that Adorno succeeds in demonstrating the methodological specificity of dialectical science only through the use of impermissible equivocations and presuppositions. He does this by conflating the dialectical contradictions of the object with the logical contradictions of the subject. Or respectively, of the theory, thereby seeking to legitimize the latter as, quote, dialectical. Within a, quote, logico-scientistic system of thought, unquote, Adorno argues, the, quote, real antagonisms, unquote, of the capitalist mode of production cannot be grasped, for, quote, terror without end can also, quote, function, yet to function as an end in itself, detached from the purpose for which it functions, constitutes no less a contradiction than any logical one, and a science that falls silent in the face of this would be irrational, unquote. Adorno. However, Adorno's own characterization of the logic of capital is not entirely rational itself. Ultimately, its purpose is not to serve human ends, specifically the satisfaction of needs for use values, but rather the accumulation of value. That is to say, a socially mediated existence devoid of material content, operating under conditions of autonomous private production. Capitalism thus indeed renders the imminent goal of material reproduction independent of human needs. However, this does not constitute a contradiction that is in any way, in the sense of identity logic, incomprehensible. The telos, the quote, for the sake of which, end quote, of this functioning is simply defined differently, as devoid of material content. The following example from Adorno, which engages more concretely with Marx's critique of political economy, also fails to achieve its ambitious objective, namely to justify the logical contradictoriness of theories by reference to the contradictory character of their subject matter, thereby, quote, dialectically surpassing Popper's approach. Adorno speaks of the, quote, logical contradictoriness, end quote, of exchange, arguing that the, quote, assertion of the equivalence of the items exchanged, the very basis of all exchange, is disavowed by the actual consequences of that exchange. Adorno contends that exchange, through its extension to the relationship between labor, power, and capital, transforms into a relation of unfreedom and inequality, a relation whose formula reads, quote, that in exchange everything proceeds, quote, by the book, end quote, and yet at the same time does not proceed, quote, by the book, end quote, Adorno. However, the central point of Marx's explanation regarding the genesis of profit, an explanation grounded in the principle of equivalent exchange, does not rest upon the mere juxtaposition of a statement and its logical opposite concerning the exchange process. Rather, it demonstrates that the actual determinations of freedom and equality within exchange are, at a different level of analysis, specifically the immediate process of production, conceived as the consumption of labor power, interactively linked with the determinations of external domination and exploitation. In doing so, Marx simultaneously critiques the projection of the determinations of exchange onto the entire reproduction process of capital, as well as their conceptual misconstrual as merely a structural form of that process. Thus, Adorno's engagement with the dialectical character of the critique of economics, or even merely with some of its aspects, remains underdeveloped. One second. However, even within the context of the new Marx reading, the concept of a logically systemic exposition has been the subject of considerable controversy since the second half of the 1970s. In this process, the methodological battle lines, which were still heavily ideologically charged during the, quote, positivism dispute of the 1960s, begin to dissolve and gradually shift into the sphere of Marxist discourse itself, a development noted with suspicion even by contemporary proponents of the party official doctrine. Positions oriented toward analytic philosophy of science and structuralist Marxism also begin to emerge, though those remaining in the broad sense, quote, Hegelian Marxist, continue to dominate. All these approaches endeavor to clarify the dialectical character of exposition postulated by Marx, and to answer the question of the extent to which this character is compatible with standard explanatory models in the philosophy of science. The analytic positions, presented here first by way of example, reveal a trajectory of development ranging from traditionally, quote, Popperian views through a, quote, methodological approach grounded in model theory to a perspective that emphasizes the strategic function of dialectics within the mode of exposition. All of them stem from the legitimate desire to take a stand against the misuse of the term, quote, dialectics as a, quote, keyword that explains nothing, end quote. Thus, for instance, Hubert Roth Leutner, writing from an analytic perspective, proposes that the term, quote, dialectics be initially understood as a placeholder for a yet-to-be-provided precise definition of specific types of relations. Quote, whenever a dialectical relationship is asserted, one should instead speak, at least initially, of, quote, some relationship or other. The term, quote, dialectical would then no longer be perceived as the ultimate salvic solution, but could instead be understood as an invitation to investigate the specific relationships in detail. End quote. Hubert Rothleutner. However, such an approach differs from the way Marx had traditionally been treated, particularly in critical rationalist circles, in that they accord Marx's capital a genuine claim to scientific status. One second. Okay, new section. Marxist dialectic from the perspective of analytical positions. Roland Simon Schaeffer aims to reconstruct the rational content of dialectical statements while simultaneously critiquing methodological misunderstandings on the part of both dialecticians and anti-dialecticians. Both groups, in his view, not infrequently miss the mark regarding their subject matter. Popper's critical rationalism, upon which Simon Schaeffer builds, initially replaces the search for positive, ultimate grounds of knowledge with the negative principle of a search for contradictions to falsifiably formulated hypotheses, thereby seeking to evade the logical pitfalls and science policy consequences of the Munchausen trilemma, inherent in absolutist strategies of justification. In doing so, Simon Schaeffer follows Popper's understanding of dialectic as a descriptive model of theory dynamics, conceived as cognitive progress achieved through criticism, specifically through logical contradictions within or between theories. An inadequate theory provokes criticism from a theory TQ. I guess that stands for theory P and theory Q. I guess that's what the T stand for. Just like as kind of out in algebraically represented. The conflict between these two theories is then resolved either in a third theory, one that, quote, unites within itself the explanatory achievements of both thesis and antithesis, unquote, or by modifying theory Q to such an extent that it can accommodate the valid explanations provided by theory P. Thus, according to Simon Schaeffer, dialectical theories, qua meta-theories of cognitive progress, presuppose the validity of the law of non-contradiction, conversely misinterpreting dialectic as a negation of this law, or as a conjunction of logically contradictory statements, leads in his view to a stagnation of theory dynamics and ultimately to irrationalism. However, no laws governing scientific development can be derived from such descriptive dialectical theories. One cannot formulate predictions based on them regarding, quote, which theories will be developed in the near future, end quote, since, quote, we today do not yet possess our knowledge of tomorrow, end quote. According to Popper, the most that can be derived from them is a methodological principle, describing the advancement of knowledge as a process devoid of a, quote, collective subject, a process brought about by the, quote, dialectical interplay, i.e. by argument and counter-argument of many actors, yields for the individual researcher the directive to internalize and anticipate the counter-arguments, criticism or logical contradictions of others, and to constantly expose one's own theories to criticism, the method of falsificationism. In transition to an object theoretical usage, Simon Schaeffer's concept of dialectic shifts in meaning, from designating a process of generating and resolving logical contradictions between theories to designating a process of reciprocities between elements of non-theoretical reality. He regards the failure to distinguish precisely this difference as a central error of the, quote, positivism critical dialecticians. Real dialectical contradictions are defined as, quote, polarities, between which real interaction, quote, exists, as special cases of causal relations within, quote, feedback systems, unquote. Furthermore, a dialectical understanding of the subject matter implies a critique of both essentialist holisms, which posit a collective subject and a telos underlying the historical process, and elementarist positions, which view individual entities in isolation and seek to, quote, explain themselves from within themselves, end quote. However, the exposition of dialectical states of affairs does not require a specifically dialectical method or explanation. Consequently, all attempts to reconstruct such a method as a specifically Marxian type of scientific argumentation are bound to fail, giving birth to nonsensical, quote, conceptual monstrosities, end quote. From this perspective of the unity of science, Marx's method in Capital is nothing other than a deductively nomological explanation of dialectical states of affairs. In this context, the contradictions are, quote, not ones in which the author Marx becomes entangled and which he resolves through dialectical argumentation, i.e. by weighing arguments against counter-arguments, end quote, but rather contradictions in a metaphorical sense inherent in the subject matter itself, understood as, quote, polarities, counter-effects, and antagonisms, end quote. Even the, quote, dialectic of analysis and synthesis, end quote, the movement from the concrete to the abstract, and thence back again to the comprehended concrete, which Marx describes in the introduction to the Grundrisse, even the, quote, dialectic of analysis and synthesis, end quote, the movement from the concrete to the abstract. Sorry, I fucked up. Jesus Christ, that was a really bad fuck up. Even the, quote, dialectic of analysis and synthesis, end quote, the movement from the concrete to the abstract and thence back again to the comprehended concrete, which Marx describes in the introduction to the Grundrisse, does not, it is argued, represent a new type of scientific rationality, but rather a standard combination of familiar non-dialectical methods. The difference between a deductive unfolding and a dialectical treatment of theories thus lies solely in the fact that the former generates logical derivations from premises deemed valid, whereas the latter consists in the attempt to falsify those premises. A dialectical, that is to say, falsificatory method of theory formation should therefore be applied only to the context of discovery of a theory, its, quote, mode of inquiry. Simon Schaeffer's reflections on the Marxian method operate on a highly abstract level of philosophy of science. However, as soon as they become more concrete, they fail to grasp the specific nature of the critique of political economy. A precise analysis of the layers of meaning inherent in the concept of contradiction remains a desideratum. Any function of this concept as a strategy of exposition, alongside a descriptive one, is ruled out. Not even the use of, quote, problem antinomies, end quote. That is, in the sense of the concept presented here, quote, metatheoretically dialectical, end quote. Elements within the framework of deductive derivation is recognized. Conversely, the, quote, logico-historical reading is accepted, and the sequence of exposition in Marx's Capital is interpreted as a succession of historically empirical models. Parenthesis, the model of a, quote, commodity exchanging society without money, end quote, is superseded by that of a, quote, social formation utilizing money, end quote. And finally, by that of a, quote, society with a capitalist economy, end quote, in parenthesis. This ultimately leads to the thesis of a methodological identity between Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. A thesis that can certainly be characterized as a, quote, strategy of trivialization. The model-theoretic interpretation of Marx's critique presupposed here operates entirely within the framework already outlined by Ronald L. Meek in the 1950s. Meek's model-theoretic classification of the Marxian approach represents a modified version of the historicist paradigm. According to this view, an economic model is underpinned by a, quote, vision of the economic process, end quote, a set of fundamental social theoretic assumptions regarding the structure of the social whole and its primary determining factors. Following an examination of economic facts, these are subsequently ranked according to a scale of relevance corresponding to that vision. Those facts deemed essential serve to construct more concrete concepts capable of capturing specific tendencies and laws. However, such statements of interconnection constitute merely abstract models of economic reality. Through the successive incorporation of additional facts drawn from the scale of relevance, they generate progressively closer approximations to the richness and complexity of reality, a process in which the laws established in earlier models are modified, complicated, and even revised by facts previously left out of consideration. Ultimately, this program of successively lifting abstractions and progressively concretizing models reaches its conclusion at the point, quote, where the essential laws and tendencies threaten to be stifled by assumptions and qualifications, end quote. At that juncture, the, quote, finished model is deployed for the purposes of forecasting. According to Meek, this general model theoretic schema is also found in Marx. What is considered specific to Marx's approach is merely the content of the models, or more precisely the vision underpinning them. Marx posits production relations rather than isolated individuals and their dispositions as the explanatory basis for economic phenomena, and places the explanation of, quote, capital income, that is, not merely the form of value per se, but rather surplus value, at the very top of the scale of relevance. In doing so, Meek combines Engels' historicism with a perspective that focuses more explicitly on the, quote, constructed character of the simple categories found in Marx's Capital. Like Smith, Marx proceeds from a methodologically employed myth, the, quote, mythology of an epoch of simple commodity production, or the model of the predominance of the commodity relation in a society devoid of the capital relation, in order to utilize this as an analytic tool for grasping the specific laws of the capitalist mode of production with the aim of clarifying their, quote, quasi-effects upon the laws of appropriation governing simple commodity exchange. According to Meek, This, quote, postulate of an abstract pre-capitalist society, end quote, is intended to provide neither detailed nor particularly realistic descriptions of earlier epochs, nor the, quote, blueprint for an ideal form of society, end quote. In contrast to the classical school, however, Marx's critique is credited with the distinction that its methodology does not target some prehistoric state, something arising directly from the ahistorical, quote, essence of man, end quote, but rather a, quote, historically earlier form of a specific stage in social development, end quote. In the model theoretic interpretation of Marx's mode of presentation, paradigmatically formulated by Meek, Ingo's methodological commentaries continue to be lauded as, quote, to this day unsurpassed, end quote, and a pre-capitalist past, albeit one bearing distinctly fictional traits, is identified as the subject matter of the first 3 chapters of Marx's Capital. Statements pertaining to labor value theory, however, are regarded as myths serving a didactic function, myths that may be subsequently retracted in the course of the unfolding exposition. Thus, economic historical objections can be evaded, quote, methodologically, end quote, and the traditional understanding of value theory can nonetheless be upheld. Ultimately, within this model theoretic approach, there is no room for any methodological divergence between Marx and the classical school. Neither Marx's critique of Ricardo's method of abstraction and his subsumption logical mode of presentation, nor his critique of the monetary theories of the classical school, which Marx advances as early as the first chapter of Capital, a chapter that, according to Meek, leans so heavily upon the labor value doctrines of Smith and Ricardo, is taken into account. Consequently, there is quite consistently no mention whatsoever of a dialectical mode of presentation. In his book titled Marxismus als Methode, Marxism as Method, Christoph Hellberger consistently adheres to this Ricardo Marxist model theory. Hellberger conceives of Marx's theory of value as a substantialist theory of labor, quantities, and focuses exclusively on its quantitative aspects. Although he acknowledges that value is legitimately a category not directly reducible to observational statements, he regards it, due to the incorporation of effective social demand into the determination of the magnitude of value, is, quote, logically equivalent to price theory, end quote. Hellberger views Marx entirely as a Ricardian in terms of value theory, one who merely, quote, contributed more himself, end quote, to the issue of exploitation. Value theory, he argues, can acquire, quote, real significance only if interpreted in a substantialist manner. Yet, as such, it is supposedly too complex and simply contradicts experience. And the theoretical language of the value level thus lacks any explanatory function. Quite simply, no, quote, facts can be explained, end quote, by means of it. In this regard, Hellberger displays an unparalleled ignorance regarding the fundamental qualitative questions of political economy. The fact that forms of wealth cannot be explained using empirical categories of price or action does not even register as a problem for Hellberger. Hellberger. Christoph Hellberger. Following Meek, the mode of presentation in Capital is characterized as adhering to the, quote, method of diminishing abstraction, end quote, specifically as the construction of progressively more comprehensive and empirically concrete models. In the first volume, Marx is said to proceed from the simplifying assumption of a model of perfect competition, featuring balanced growth, a correspondence between supply and demand, an identity of values and prices, and the appropriation of surplus value by capitalist entrepreneurs, which he then successively revises and adjusts to align with observable phenomena. In this context, Hellberger deems it illegitimate to reify the sequence of presentation, or more precisely the various underspecified and unrealistic models, into assertions regarding spatio-temporal processes. The propositions and concepts found at the beginning of Marx's critique are not independent, real, or still less, more significant processes that are subsequently modified by the categories that follow or by the forms designated by those categories. Thus, the conceptual sequence does not represent a historical process. However, this approach, which interprets value theoretical categories as, quote, analytical constructions, unquote, is much like Meek's, flanked by historicist conceptions of method and subject matter. Consequently, it fails to grasp the explanatory significance of the sequential ordering of categories, an ordering which in Marx's work is intended to point to the mutual implication or objective interconnection of simple and complex social relations. Instead, the process of successively withdrawing abstractions is here left entirely to the arbitrary discretion of the theorist. The sequence of categories is not intended to reproduce an objective internal coherence among economic phenomena, but rather to represent a nominalistic construction that gradually guides the reader through a, quote, external enrichment of complicating factors, unquote, toward realistic scientific propositions. It is thus reducible to a purely subjective and didactic dimension, to a textbook style and a methodological issue of, quote, third or fourth rate, end quote, importance. Since, quote, ultimately what matters is neither the individual stages of a theory's construction nor the order in which the laws of the final theory are enumerated, end quote. And since, quote, ultimately the only decisive factor is the final formulation of the theory, end quote. Helberger recommends as an alternative positing empirical laws right at the very beginning of the exposition. As early as the 1960s, the Soviet author Igor S. Narsky offered an examination of a specific aspect of Marx's exposition, a perspective that falls within the broader sphere of analytical positions and was subsequently taken up in the West German debate, countering prominent representatives of the Orthodox school, such as Ilyenkov, Rosenthal, and Elitz. Narsky critiques the thesis regarding the existence of true, formally logically contradictory judgments. According to S. Narsky, even if judgments of a logically contradictory nature do emerge in the course of a dialectical exposition, they possess the character of a mere, quote, problem antinomies, end quote. These serve a methodological function, but are resolved, and thereby stripped of their logically contradictory character, in the course of the investigation through the process of precise definition. Firmly rooted in the tradition of analytical thought, Narsky sets out to demonstrate that within dialectical theory there exist, quote, no special dialectical judgments or interferences that would differ in their stricture from those of formal logic, end quote. Within the framework of dialectical logic, problem antinomies thus represent a provisional and inadequate reproduction of objectively dialectical contradictions, quote, at the level of subjective dialectic, end quote. They are regarded as a phase of exposition that fulfills the heuristic function of identifying dialectical contradictions in a form that is still imprecise, merely, quote, similar to actual conditions. In the context of the critique of political economy, they are accorded only the status of, quote, didactic problems, end quote, which, quote, reproduce the movement of cognition that has been traversed, i.e., reproduce problems that were previously posed, and thereby resolved heuristically, end quote. Narsky identifies the structure primarily in Marx's circulation production antinomy in the book Capital, where, in the course of addressing the, quote, contradictions of the general formula, end quote, money commodity, money prime, and the question of the conceptual graspability of capital, it is formulated, quote, capital therefore cannot spring from circulation, and it is equally impossible for it not to spring from circulation. It must arise both within it and not within it. These are the conditions of the problem, end quote. According to Narsky, the synthesis, as the Aufhebung, sublation, of this contradiction must under no circumstances be confused with the mere junction of the contradictory statements. If the antinomy is to indicate a dialectical contradiction, one must move beyond it. Its logical structure, A, not A, is to be considered valid only in the sense of an imprecise yet logically non-contradictory formulation. This means that the structure, quote, arises in Z and does not arise in Z, quote, which manifests as a contradictory contradiction, where K is both B and non-B at the same time and in the same respect, in parentheses, must be exposed as a pseudo-antinomy and transformed into the structure of a non-logical dialectical contradiction, where K is both B and non-B in different respects at the same time, or in the same respect at different points in time. The synthesis here consists in the precise definition of the meanings of the thesis and the antithesis, and in the consequent overcoming of their contradictory character. It is thus regarded as the result of the conscious avoidance of logical contradictions. The solution to the production-circulation antinomy regarding the genesis of surplus value lies, therefore, in viewing capital as constituted within production, yet mediated through circulation, specifically as mediated through the purchase of the commodity, quote, labor power, parenthesis, a precise formulation of, quote, in circulation, end quote, in parenthesis, generating through the consumption of the, quote, use value, end quote, of this commodity, more value than is required for its own reproduction, parenthesis, a process formulation of, quote, in production, a precise formulation of, quote, in production, end quote, and parenthesis. The solution, therefore, implies neither a mere summation of the partial truths of the thesis and the antithesis, parenthesis, quote, partly this, partly that, end quote, and parenthesis, nor the truth of merely one of the theses, parenthesis, quote, A or B, end quote, and parenthesis. Narski, however, emphasizes the limited scope of the application of the representational pattern of resolving problem antinomies in Marx's Capital. It offers no alternative interpretation for other concepts of contradiction within Marx's critique. Narski appears, for instance, to be unclear as to the extent to which the contradiction between use value and value is a contradictory one, or more precisely, one initially formulated in a logically contradictory manner. Narski characterizes the assertion that, quote, commodity-producing labor, end quote, possesses a, quote, concrete and non-concrete, i.e. abstract character, end quote, as the, quote, looming, end quote, of an antinomy. Gerhard Güler, in turn, criticizes Narski, arguing that the model of, quote, contradiction development as contradiction avoidance, end quote, fails to capture, quote, the development of the contradiction that is at issue in the development from commodity to money, end quote. The following position, too, will have to confront this problem, though it possesses a far more elaborate character than the West German approaches presented thus far. For in the text of Ulrich Steinfort, in contrast to the analytical contributions previously outlined with reference to Simon Schaeffer and Hellberger, a genuine strategic function of presentation is ascribed to the dialectical development of contradictions. Here, dialectic is defined as a, quote, method for constructing a deductive theory, through the analysis of compatibility conditions, end quote. However, this, quote, construction is by no means merely a part of the, quote, context of discovery, end quote, but rather an element of the presentation of the research findings. According to Steinfort, the rational core of Hegelian dialectic employed by Marx consists in the, quote, construction of a model of derivation, end quote, understood as a conceptual analysis of systemic regularities, parenthesis, the quote, laws of the mode of production, as well as in the historical prognosis of a specific regularity that leads to the collapse of the object under investigation, or in other words, in the quote, prediction of its end, end quote. This is what Marx meant by the assertion that, with any positive understanding of the existing order, the quote, understanding of its negation, of its necessary demise, end quote, is already implicitly contained. Consequently, within the framework of this conceptual analysis, and in contrast to Engels, Marx does not seize upon a merely historically contingent fact in order to trace its quote, contradictory development, end quote, parenthesis, e.g. its transformation into its opposite, end parenthesis. Instead, he proceeds from two contradictory properties posited as the necessary definitions of a given state of affairs, specifically the dual character of the labor objectified in commodities, which is here defined as the twofold quote, goal of labor, to produce use values and to realize exchange values. A good can be designated as a commodity only if it is produced for exchange. By virtue of this condition, it acquires a dual character, quote, with analytical necessity, end quote. In contrast, Steinfort argues that the historicist tradition within Marxism links, quote, dialectics to empirical propositions concerning objects that do not possess such a necessary dual character, for instance, the productive forces and the relations of production. Dialectical exposition now seeks the conditions of compatibility for these two necessary yet seemingly mutually exclusive properties of the object. The form of such a compatibility analysis is as follows. Only if object Q is given as E and E prime as properties of object P compatible, and is the object of investigation object P actually given. This is going to be hard to follow. This statement logically implies, by inversion, the major premise of a deductively nomological explanation. Whenever E and E prime are given, Q is given. The analysis now takes the compatibility condition Q as the analysis's starting point, and identifies within it a further developed form of the original pair of opposites, E and E, which in terms of content always represent use value and exchange value, in order to find in turn a compatibility condition for this new pair. This process continues, quote, until a pair of properties is found that is genuinely incompatible, end quote. Steinfort's concept of dialectical exposition can be characterized as the analytical pursuit of contradictory statements until the discovery of a non-logical real contradiction. The necessary properties are described by a contradictory, logically inconsistent statement, which through the discovery of a compatibility condition proves to be, quote, only seemingly contradictory, end quote. Dialectical arguments thus presuppose the validity of the law of non-contradiction, since contradictory opposites can exist exclusively within statements, and not in reality. They are deemed unreal opposites, as long as they can be demonstrated to be such, whereby the compatibility condition is identified with what Marx termed the, quote, form of solution, end quote, or, quote, form of movement, end quote, of contradictions. The object described by them can exist. However, as soon as a, quote, real existence, of the state of affairs described by the contradictory pair, end quote, is established, one must conclude that the object in question does not exist, or rather that it has perished. The contradiction distinguishing the capitalist mode of production between use value and exchange value can thus be characterized as a contradiction that is, quote, at first merely threatening but ultimately confirmed, end quote. This, quote, confirmed contradiction is not, however, for otherwise it would not be a really existing contradiction, a logical one, which would presuppose that state R and its negation, not R, coexist simultaneously in time and in the same respect. The negation of R, the descriptive concept of contradiction as a turning into its opposite, is the result of processes unfolding over a span of time, As such, it can be defined in a logically unassailable manner as a counter process or paradoxical effect, specifically the negation of a developmental goal brought about by the very measures taken to realize it. Formally, Steinfort presents Marx's overall model of the laws of motion of capitalism as follows. P commodities and money, and commodities to money, money to capital, capital to collapse, or something like that. Take that all with a grain of salt. The movement from P, the commodity and the contradictory properties, to Q, the movement from P, parenthesis, the commodity with contradictory properties, in parenthesis, to Q, parenthesis, money as a compatibility condition, in parenthesis, from Q, parenthesis, money as a commodity with contradictory properties, in parenthesis, to R, parenthesis, capital form as a compatibility condition, in parenthesis, is conceived as a structural analysis of given objects. As an analysis of a conceptual nexus of rules linking developed commodity exchange, the use of money, and the function of industrial capital, chapters 2 through 4 of Marx's Capital. According to Steinfort, who emphasizes this point with great clarity in opposition to the orthodoxy established by Engels, this movement, understood as a movement of analysis, need not correspond to any historical developments whatsoever. These statements of law designate the simultaneous coexistence of P and Q, or Q and R, rather than a temporal sequence leading from P to Q, or from Q to R. However, according to Steinfort, these statements of law, derived through compatibility analysis, are, not logical implications, but merely conceptual interconnections. These constitute, conceptual connections which, unlike logical implications, may occasionally be violated, yet whose violation cannot become the norm, without destroying the very object under explanation. It is solely the movement from R to T, or I don't know what exactly that symbol is. Some symbol looks like a T. Combination of a T and a backward J. Maybe you know what that means. The contradiction inherent in the process of accumulation, which is said to precipitate the collapse of capitalism, that represents a historical prognosis, specifically a rule-governed process unfolding over time, understood as a paradoxical effect. Contrary to the assertions of Engels and Popper, this constitutes the only historical law to be found in Marx's Capital, a law, however, that does not render a socialist process of emancipation predictable as a direct outcome of the critique of political economy. How then are the specified category relationships more precisely defined? Steinfort begins his reconstruction with the initial situation of the exchange process as presented in the second chapter of Marx's Capital. Exchange serves on the one hand an individual need, namely to acquire a specific use value by exchanging one's own commodity, and on the other a general need. Every commodity owner seeks to obtain through exchange a quantity of use value sufficient to make it appear to them that the exchange value of their commodity has been realized, This problematic situation, Steinfort argues, does not presuppose Marx's theory of value, which Steinfort regards as, metaphysical ballast, Money, acting as a condition of compatibility, is subsequently introduced in the manner of a, quote, cleverly devised expedient, end quote. For as a result of this initial situation, in which commodity owners confront one another with commodities whose prices are as yet undetermined, neither the logical impossibility of constituting a general equivalent, nor the impossibility of commodities representing values for one another is deemed to apply, since the very concept of value is, in Steinvort's approach, explicitly bracketed out. The only result posited is a pragmatic predicament facing commodity owners, the necessity of having to, quote, search too long, end quote, before finding, quote, an exchange partner willing to trade a commodity possessing both the correct use value and the required exchange value, end quote. Significantly, Karl Menger is cited as an economist who likewise demonstrates the necessity of money-media exchange in precisely this manner. The, quote, law of commodity exchange, end quote, derived in this way, which asserts that developed commodity exchange exists only when commodities are exchanged via money, acting as a substitute commodity, is thus grounded in purely pragmatic terms, specifically on the basis of the, quote, difficulties inherent in pre-monetary exchange and the, quote, facilitations afforded by monetary exchange. Another passage in which Steinfort points to the, quote, necessity of the monetary character of commodity exchange processes also fails to convince. Thus he writes that Marx designates, quote, as a good a commodity, quote, a good is a commodity only when it is already produced for exchange, and exchange, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, without monetary mediation is therefore, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, not a commodity exchange, but rather, quote, a media exchange of products, end quote. Marx. Commodity exchange is therefore, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, for Marx, always exchange mediated by money, end quote. It remains a mystery where, in this instance, a valid conclusion is supposed to be derived from the assumed premises. Within the circulation of commodities, commodity, money, commodity, a contradiction is identified between the function of money as a medium of circulation, conceived as a fleeting means for the appropriation of others' use values, and its function as a store of value, conceived as a, quote, function of providing protection against the uncertainty of commodity exchange, end quote. According to this view, the satisfaction of need is secured only if commodity producers remain continuously in possession of the universal medium of exchange. However, in order to acquire others' goods, money must be expended as a medium of circulation. Marx demonstrates that this contradiction cannot be resolved by each commodity owner acting as a merchant capitalist to increase their money through unequal exchange, a strategy that would amount to a zero-sum game. Only the function of industrial capital can serve as the necessary condition for compatibility. The contradiction can be resolved only when money is used to purchase a commodity whose consumption generates more money, mediated through the production of more commodities, thereby shielding the investor from the uncertainties inherent in exchange. This, quote, problem of money hoarding, end quote, is, according to this analysis, plausibly resolved only by Marx's theory of surplus value. The, quote, law of commodity circulation, end quote, therefore asserts that commodity, money, commodity, as a systematic process, is possible only if, as a general rule, it constitutes a moment within the process of industrial capital. Money, commodity, money, prime. Steinfort argues plausibly against historicizing interpretations of the dialectical exposition, characterizing the concept of capital as a, quote, sufficiently specified, end quote, concept of commodities and money. Sorry, I'm spacing out here. Steinfort conceives of the critique of political economy as an analysis of a single object, the capitalist mode of production, conducted at various degrees of abstraction, and quote, yet without, as Simon Schaeffer and Meek did previously, assigning these degrees to specific historical epochs. However, his view regarding the status of these respective levels of abstraction aligns with that of pragmatic action-theoretic models oriented toward the problem of the adequate mode of existence of value, but rather toward action-related difficulties that are statistically insoluble. Ultimately, Steinfort derives economic forms from the actors themselves and their needs. Consequently, Steinfort is compelled to deny the systematic significance of the first chapter of Marx's Capital, precisely the chapter in which the figure of the commodity owner is abstracted away. Finally, it seems implausible to regard the contradiction between use value and value as, quote, real, only in the context of a crisis of total collapse. The question thus arises, what structural conditions are at work in imminent, e.g. cyclical crises, if not the real contradiction between use value and value as embodied in commodities and money? In Steinfort's approach, the phenomenon of crisis is therefore conceivable solely as a crisis of total collapse, since according to Steinfort, it is only at this juncture that a real contradiction emerges, one that, when viewed in a temporal dimension, can be deciphered as non-logical, representing the system and its negation. Moreover, this crisis of total collapse must be understood as the outcome of a system that otherwise reproduces itself without crisis. All right, so new section, section 2. The peculiar logic of a peculiar object. In contrast to Steinfort's I think actually I'm going to call it here. Fuck. I don't know what to do. Fuck it, I'll just keep going. New section, section 2. The particular logic of a peculiar object. In contrast to Steinfort's abstract juxtaposition of unreal contradiction and real compatibility condition, or alternatively a systematic collapse no longer exhibiting this condition, which ultimately reduces contradiction and its forms of resolution to a mere, quote, arrangement of representation, and, quote, Andreas Arndt, above all others, insist upon the reality of the constellations of contradiction analyzed in Marx's Capital. Neither is an imminent crisis conceivable within Steinfort's analytical frame of reference, nor is a purported collapse rationally justifiable. The notion that, quote, a real society is destroyed by the development of apparent contradictions, for which a new society then offers itself as a compatibility condition, is itself a contradiction, end quote. For Marx, conversely, contradictions and their forms of resolution did not mark the end of the object, quote, capitalism. Rather, they were, first and foremost, imminent determinations. Marx explicitly points this out when he observes that the, quote, development of the commodity, end quote, does not, quote, resolve the, quote, real contradictions between use value and value, but instead, quote, creates the form in which they can move, end quote. According to Arndt, the category of the, quote, form of motion denotes a process that is, quote, understood simultaneously as a compatibility condition and as a perpetuation of antagonistic relations, end quote. Conditions of compatibility are, therefore, by no means object theoretical propositions that resolve statements concerning imaginary contradictions. Rather, they are properties elicited within and operative through processes, such as the equivalent form and the money form, that persist and function as elements of the conditions of socialization, which in turn generate the contradictory which in turn generate the contradictory determinations rendered, quote, compatible within them. They constitute a mediation of elements whose separateness they constantly presuppose and ceaselessly reproduce anew. Quote, that a contradiction creates it for itself, the form in which it can move is therefore the immanent form through which a contradiction resolves itself, unquote. Namely, quote, under the presupposition of that very totality which constitutes the condition of its existence, unquote. From this, one must distinguish a conception that lies closer to the ordinary understanding of what constitutes the resolution of contradictions, a conception that signifies rather the destruction of the very conditions of existence of those contradictory determinations. It is precisely this commonsensical, everyday notion of the resolution of contradictions which nevertheless constitutes the objective of emancipatory action as the sublation of specific contradictions that one encounters in Steinfort's thought. Excuse me. In summary, Andreas Arendt now characterizes Marx's concept of the real contradiction as follows. Quote, the contradiction in Marx is a, quote, real contradiction, a self-realizing processual contradiction, whose extremes acting as autonomous opposites are continually renewed in relation to one another within this movement. In this context, their identity, under the conditions of the contradiction's existence, does not signify an essential identity transcending the autonomy of the opposites, into which they might be subsumed as mere moments. It signifies only that the opposite, in their autonomy, do not fall apart indifferently, but rather remain related to one another, end quote. Aren't. In these remarks, we have already arrived at another current within the new reading of Marx, one whose positions are to be examined in greater detail in the following section. In this context, the discussion of the concept of contradiction within Marxian theory is increasingly moving to the forefront of the debate. Here, to take a step back, both chronologically and argumentatively, an investigation by the Italian Marxist Lucio Coletti initially exerted a significant influence on the discourse within the Federal Republic. Coletti accuses Marxism of conflating two distinct types of opposition, real opposition and dialectical contradiction. Real opposition and dialectical contradiction, a conflation which he argues ultimately implies that, quote, the collision of two automobiles, a typical instance of real, quote, real opposition, namely of two forces moving in opposite directions, constitutes daily proof of dialectical materialism, end quote. Coletti. The distinction between these two types can be described as follows. The Marxist idea of a, quote, real dialectic is, in this view, pure Hegelianism, a system that relates the finite or being to the infinite or spirit, according to the model of polar opposition, rather than recognizing it as an autonomous mode of existence. Consequently, this, quote, drama of Marxism carries dangerous political implications, as illustrated by the example of Kolakowski, who reduces the methodologies of the natural sciences to date to a form of positivism that he denounces as mere ideology. Anyone who, like Coletti, attempts to resolve the problems of the natural sciences by means of dialectical materialism, thereby, quote, adopts a critically negative stance towards existing scientific disciplines, end quote, a stance that aligns itself with an irrational theological form of anti-scientific sentiment. Science, by contrast, rightly operates according to the law of non-contradiction, which serves as the, quote, principle of material determinacy and of the coherence of propositions, end quote. Conversely, Coletti cites a discussion regarding questions of logic published in the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie in the early 1950s, an exemplary instance of maintaining a constructive relationship between Marxism and science. The contributions of Linke, Harek, and Ajdukiewicz, that's Ajdukiewicz. The contributions of Linke, Harek, and Ajdukiewicz, he argues, demonstrate that references to a, quote, dialectic of matter, end quote, actually denote real oppositions. Thus one may legitimately speak of, quote, objective contradictions, end quote, without violating the law of non-contradictions. According to Ajdukiewicz, I don't know how to say this guy's name. According to Ajdukiewicz, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, one of the famous, quote, fundamental laws of dialectics, end quote, within Marxist-Leninist thought, is scientifically valid precisely because antagonistic tendencies, parenthesis, e.g., quote, action and reaction, cause and counter effect, end quote, end parenthesis, quote, do not signify the same thing as the relationship between the being and the non-being of one and the same state of affairs, end quote. In this context, a reaction is not the, quote, non-beginning of the action, but rather an autonomous force in its own right. Whoa! Get out of here. Fuck, that's scary. So fucking, I'm like in like this like weird like kind of like alley, kind of like between like my parents' house and the house next to ours, and I guess some neighborhood cat started coming up in there, in between the trees, and it scared the shit out of me. I thought it was like a fox. I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna get eaten alive by this fox. It freaked me out. And I just see like a tail wagging in the darkness. I'm like, Jesus Christ. According to Ajdukiewicz, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, one of the famous, quote, fundamental laws of dialectics, end quote, within Marxist-Leninist thought, is scientifically valid precisely because antagonistic tendencies, parenthesis, e.g., quote, action and reaction, cause and counter effect, end quote, end parenthesis, quote, do not signify the same thing as the relationship between being and non-being of one and the same state of affairs, end quote. In this context, a reaction is not the, quote, non-being of the action, but rather an autonomous force in its own right. However, Coletti now observes that Marx does not merely criticize However, Coletti now observes that Marx does not merely criticize Hegel's inversions of subject and object and hypostatizations of the abstract in a nominalist fashion, as, quote, flawed modes of Hegelian logic, for reflecting reality, end quote, but rather discovers them within capitalist reality as real inversions and hypostatizations, thereby deciphering the truth of idealism. For Marx the critic, the forms of social wealth are products of alienation, not merely a positive reality. Yet in order to define the concept of inversion as alienation, Coletti now cites statements regarding the, quote, Trinitarian formula, end quote, statements that initially and unequivocally conceive of, quote, inversion as an ideological phenomenon, specifically as the fetishistic illusion of the, quote, immediate intergrowth of the material relations of production with their historical social specificity, end quote. It is only in this sense, the sense of an illusion induced by objectively mediated relations, suggesting that capital generates interest, land generates ground rent, and labor generates wages, that Marx speaks of, quote, how everything in this mode of production presents itself in an inverted form, end quote. However, in order to, quote, prove that Marx is here describing reality itself as a topsy-turvy, irrational form, Coletti now cites the remark, quote, the inverted form in which the real inversion expresses itself is naturally reproduced in the notions of the agents of this mode of production, end quote. Following the word, quote, expresses, one finds Coletti's annotation, quote, nota bene. Coletti fails to notice, however, that this, quote, real inversion constitutes alienation, understood as the autonomization of the relations of production vis-a-vis the social actors, and does not denote an irrational constitution of reality itself. Therein something is simultaneously historical social and ahistorical asocial. Coletti thus interprets Marx's critique of fetishism as his positive description of capitalist reality, and on this basis distinguishes Marx the scientist from Marx the, quote, critic of political economy, end quote. On the one hand, Coletti argues, Marx continues the tradition of political economy established by Smith and Ricardo, taking as his object a, quote, positively presupposed, end quote, reality, specifically economic laws of motion conceived by analogy with natural laws. On the other hand, he acts as a disciple of Hegel and Feuerbach in that he conceives the reality of the capitalist mode of production as a product of the alienation of the human species. In this context, the laws of this mode of production represent for Marx the, quote, fetishistic reification of human social relations, end quote. Coletti admits that he fails to grasp how the invocation of the, quote, natural laws of capitalism and the inversion of subject and object are interrelated. While he surmises that these, quote, natural laws represent an autonomization of the social synthesis brought about by historically specific conditions regarding the socialization of labor, Coletti nonetheless asserts that such conceptions possess a character incompatible with scientific rationality. Marx, he argues, conceives the contradictions of capitalism as dialectical, for instance, viewing economic crisis as the violent restoration of unity between extremes that are constitutively bound together yet have become mutually autonomous. According to Coletti, the poles of this contradiction, commodity and money, are real precisely because they are separated, a, quote, real opposition, end quote, yet simultaneously unreal because they belong together, parenthesis, a, quote, unity of opposites, end quote, in parenthesis. Quote, they have assumed reality insofar as they have separated, end quote, parenthesis, referring to the use value and the value of specific commodities, now embodied in the distinct forms of commodity and money, end parenthesis. Quote, but insofar as they are inseparable, they have become real, even though they are not really so. They have become real as things, even though they are not things at all. They are a product of alienation, intrinsically unreal magnitudes, albeit ones that have undergone reification, end quote. The object of Marx's critique thus reveals itself as an irrational entity, as something simultaneously real and unreal, objective and non-objective. According to Coletti, however, for Marx, dialectical presentation is the exclusive hallmark of a, quote, perverted reality, end quote, whereas Diamat views dialectical contradiction as a, quote, property of any reality whatsoever, end quote. Coletti is left only with the uncertainty as to whether Marx's critique proves, quote, disastrous or fruitful, unquote, for the foundational grounding of the social sciences. Whether Marx the philosopher and Marx the scientist can be reconciled, and if so, how? Coletti's theses, or at least his enigmatic approach of constructing the object of economic critique in such a peculiar manner that its distinctive mode of presentation flies squarely in the face of analytical scientific standards, have also gained considerable currency within the West German intellectual debate. In contrast to Coletti, Hans Friedrich Fulda insists upon the difference between the Marxian and the Hegelian concepts of contradiction, for he draws upon Althusser's thesis that Marx's inversion of Hegelian dialectic does not merely exchange its substrate, but alters the very structure of the dialectic itself. Unlike Althusser, who addressed this question solely at the level of the complexity or, quote, expressive reducibility of the object of the competing dialectics, Fulda identifies a transformation in the concept of contradiction from Hegel to Marx, a movement from, quote, speculative to, quote, real opposition, as well as a reversal of the correlation between essence as unity and appearance as contradiction. The Hegelian contradiction, conceived as a, quote, strictly symmetrical, unquote, relationship between mutually implicating extremes, is held to resolve back into the essence as its unified harmonious ground, thereby revealing itself as a contradiction only at the level of appearance. Marx conversely traces contradictions within appearance back to deeper lying essential contradictions. Quote, Hegel's main error, end quote, Marx wrote in 1843, quote, consists in the fact that he grasped the contradiction of appearance as a unity within the essence, within the idea, whereas in reality it possesses something deeper as its essence, namely an essential contradiction, end quote. In this context, the extremes of the opposition, qua real opposition, are denied a symmetrical status and are, moreover, held to be mutually irreducible. Thus, in opposition to Coletti, the concept of real oppositionality is here characterized by its, quote, essentiality and by the figure of the dominant extreme. In opposition to the harmonizing thrust of speculative dialectics, a materialist critique, conceived as a mode of presentation for material not derived dialectically, is posited. A critique of the, quote, semblance of harmony, such as the conflation of use value and value, and an exposition of contradictions is underlying instability inducing, quote, dysfunctional properties, end quote, of a system. These contradictions find limited forms of expression in the guise of, quote, contradiction resolving institutionalizations, end quote, until ultimately this dysfunctionality comes openly to light in a breakdown, crisis, thereby precipitating the system's collapse. Thus, Maurras's dialectic is characterized as a, quote, form of presentation of a catastrophe theory, end quote. Oh, I think that's a mistake. Yeah, I think it's supposed to say, thus Marx's dialectic is characterized as a, quote, form of presentation for a catastrophe theory, end quote. Much like Steinfort, Fulda conceives of dialectics as a systematic mode of presentation, one that must initially be understood not as the self-movement of the object itself, but rather as a theoretical operation of, quote, our thinking, quote. until, with the onset of the breakdown constellation, these contradictions emerge as actual dysfunctionalities and, quote, come to adequate appearance, end quote. In contrast to Steinfort, however, Fulda identifies genuine oppositions as already present in the initial situation of the exchange process. Furthermore, he asserts, without offering further elaboration, that the conceptual development outlined in the first chapter of Marx's Capital, e.g., the progression from the commodity to the value form, entails transitions that are devoid of contradiction. In his 1979 dissertation titled Widerspruch und Theories Struktur, Contradiction and Theory Structure, a work closely aligned with the structuralist approach, Hermann Kosiba sets out to elucidate the semantic spectrum of the concept of contradiction as it appears within the discourse of the critique of political economy. In doing so, he initially, much like analytical Marxism, takes a stand against attempts to conceptualize dialectical contradictions as logical ones. Yet he simultaneously defends the notion that Hegelian dialectic possesses a rational content. According to Kosiba, the traditional critical rationalist critique of dialectic and the Marxist-Leninist affirmation thereof constituted a complementary system extending into the 1960s, insofar as both perspectives viewed dialectic as a violation of the law of non-contradiction. Based on positions that postulate the compatibility of dialectical contradictions and the law of identity, it will now be demonstrated that, while these positions do indeed articulate actual aspects of the Marxian discourse on, quote, dialectical contradiction, quote, they neither do justice to the semantic richness of the concept of contradiction in Marx's Capital, nor, in their reductionism to a single type of contradiction, provide a correct criterion for distinguishing rational from irrational oppositions. Coletti's restriction of, quote, real oppositions to instances of, quote, real repugnance, end quote, in particular, is open to criticism. According to Kosiba, even the mutually polar opposition between wage labor and capital is to be understood neither as a, quote, opposition of independent causal chains, end quote, nor as an irrational opposition. The concept of, quote, real opposition can capture only a specific type of non-logical contradiction, but not polar oppositions that are, from a logical standpoint, entirely unproblematic. Examples include the relations between wage labor and capital, or between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, which function as, quote, mutually constitutive relations, end quote, wherein both relata are, quote, undefinable, indeed non-existent, without reference to one another, end quote. The worker, for instance, is a wage worker only in relation to the capitalist and vice versa. The contradiction established by the determinations of, quote, owner versus, quote, non-owner of the means of production is therefore not a logical one. That is, it does not assert that the non-owners are simultaneously and in the same respect owners of the means of production. Furthermore, quote, intentional opposites, end quote, that is, antagonisms of interest, are deemed logically unproblematic and are in fact cited by Marx. If an actor possesses two interests that cannot be realized simultaneously, that, quote, mutually exclude one another in a specific to be defined respect, end quote, then the actor holds opposing interests. This does not, however, imply that the actor simultaneously holds and does not hold those interests. Similarly, the conflict of interest between different actors does not rest upon logical contradictions. Rather, it merely indicates that, quote, two parties are contending for the same good, such that both endeavors cannot be successful, end quote. A classic example being zero-sum games, such as those that figure in class struggles over the reduction of working hours, wage increases, and the like. Marx's theory of form, however, according to Kosiba, proceeds from the premise that intentional opposites possess a derived, parenthesis, i.e. structurally determined, end parenthesis, character. Accordingly, antagonisms of interest must be underlain by, quote, non-intentional structural conditions, end quote, which are themselves anchored in the conditions of the social organization of labor. Nowhere does Marx positively appeal to logical contradictions. According to Marx, such contradictions are found exclusively in classical and vulgar economics, that is, in the very objects of his critique. In these contexts, they represent theoretical inconsistencies arising from the forced unification of disparate levels of abstraction within scientific exposition, and ultimately from an empiricist standpoint of inquiry. Marx critiques the failure to differentiate between the core structure and the empirical surface of bourgeois society. He takes issue with flawed abstractions, the conflation of empirical and non-empirical categories, and the absence of mediating links between the two. Classical economics, however, is distinguished, in his view, by the fact that it acknowledges, rather than denying or theoretically smoothing over, empirical phenomena that run counter to the principles of political economy. Yet from Kosiba's perspective, logical contradictions are not merely objects of Marx's theoretical critique, and thus primarily elements of the research process. Logical contradictions also fulfill a quasi-positive function within the actual exposition of Marx's critique of political economy, namely that of serving as problem antinomies. Kosiba thus identifies in Marx's Capital a heterogeneous ensemble of various types of contradiction. Kosiba is unable to discover a unified concept of dialectical contradiction, one that, quote, multiplies itself into ever more developed, more complex contradictory relations, end quote. There exists no, quote, archetype of dialectical contradiction, no unfolding, quote, central original relation of opposition, end quote, as is formulated in reference to Althusser's critique of the model of expressive totality. Alongside, quote, descriptive context of usage, end quote, Kosiba identifies two uses of the concept of contradiction, employed with a, quote, representational strategic, end quote, intent, that play a decisive role in defining the specific character of the critique of political economy. The aforementioned concept of the problem antinomy, which organizes the, quote, transition from two structural levels, end quote, of the exposition, and the concept of forms of motion, which affects the, quote, unfolding of a structural level, end quote, through the imminent development of contradictions. In the course of tracing the trajectory of exposition in Marx's Capital, Kosiba identifies two fundamental problem antinomies, that of, quote, imminent exchange value, end quote, as a contradictio in adjecto in chapter 1.1, and the, quote, circulation antinomy in Chapter 4, both following Narsky, are, according to Kosiba, not descriptions of objectively contradictory states of affairs, but rather purely, quote, explanatorily significant, and, quote, instruments that mark the limits of a specific level of conceptual abstraction and, quote, in the interest of a logically consistent continuation of the analysis, and, quote, compel a, quote, shift in analytical terrain, and, quote. Ultimately, it is the avoidance of contradictions, he argues, that drives the analysis forward. Surprisingly, Kosiba's reconstruction lacks an explanation of the initial situation of the exchange process, even though it is precisely here that it functions as a problem antinomy, variously described as a state of, quote, utter perplexity, end quote, a, quote, absolute contradiction, end quote, that is, quote, inaccessible to any dialectical development, end quote, or a, quote, conceptual impossibility, end quote, to borrow the phrasing of Cesare Luperini and Hans-Georg Bachhaus, has repeatedly been posited as the necessary means of transitioning to the praxis of commodity owners as a subsequent level of exposition. Also left out of the picture is the problem of the transition from money to capital, as it is posed and resolved in the original text. For this transition to a different conceptual field appears, in fact, to be structured more along the lines of the second type of contradiction, a circumstance that significantly calls into question Kosiba's thesis regarding the specific function of problem antinomies within the overall structure of Marx's capital. Michael Heinrich and Dieter Wolff in particular point out that the transition from money to capital must be understood as a dialectical development of contradictions, even if Marx did not explicitly elaborate upon it in the book Capital. According to Wolff, the problem antinomy is therefore nothing more than a didactic conceit on Marx's part. Indeed, a construction that creates, quote, unnecessary confusion and is, quote, superfluous. According to Kosiba, the second type, much like the contradiction between use value and value, or that between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, serves to, quote, elaborate a theoretical field, proceeding from specific conditions of socialization that determine labor and products in a non-logical contradictory manner. The forms of appearance of simple circulation are deciphered as the external forms of motion of an immanent contradiction. The contradictory determinacy of labor and products under capitalism is characterized as, quote, non-logical, because concrete labor/use value and abstract labor/value are, quote, situated on different categorical levels, unquote. Quote, while abstract labor can indeed be viewed as the, quote, negation of concrete labor, this does not imply the presence of a logical contradiction. Labor is not simultaneously concrete and abstract in the same respect, unquote. The contradiction between use value and value within the context of the analysis of the form of value, quote, stems from the circumstance that value as such cannot appear directly, but only through forms of circulation that contradict it, end quote. In this formulation, the immanent contradiction of the commodity, which drives it toward the form of value, and the contradiction between the value of commodity A and the use value of commodity B, serving as an inadequate form of appearance for the value of A, are conflated. Kosiba observes that had Marx intended thereby to suspend the principle of non-contradiction, quote, an analysis of the forms of value would have been entirely superfluous, end quote. for in that case value and use value would have been posited as identical. The form of value conceived in turn as the form of motion of the contradiction between use value and value cannot be conceptualized as a logical opposition, since the equation of x of commodity A is worth y of commodity B implies not an equation of use value and value, but merely a polar relationship of opposition. If one considers Marx's Capital as a whole, Marx, in this view, unfolds a hierarchical interconnection and mutual superimposition of two mutually irreducible yet complementary structural levels of the object, levels that do not describe distinct entities and then piece them together, but rather simultaneously structure the very same object in different ways, thereby unfolding through the intermediate links of analysis a complex conceptual system of transformation This stance is clearly directed against a reflection theory in the tradition of Engels and Lenin, a theory according to which every concept within the theory designates a distinct entity in reality, and the succession of conceptual levels of abstraction is understood as a succession of historical epochs. Diethard Behrens and Cornelia Hofner have critically noted in this regard that the thesis concerning the conceptually constructive character of the architecture of Marx's Capital, which conceives the development of contradictions not as a historical empirical genesis, but rather as a explicative structure of the theory, remains curiously disconnected from the assertion regarding the real content of this contradictory structure, particularly with respect to the non-empirical categories of essence. Helmut Brentel, too, points out that Kosiba fails to sufficiently specify the real dialectical content of the development of contradictions, thereby in the style of analytical Marxism, receding towards a mere logic of presentation, Even if Kosiba is unable to bridge the gap between the analytical and descriptive concepts of contradiction, a problem that after all only arises in the context of a logical reading, Kosiba's work nonetheless demonstrates that many attempts at reconstruction have operated with either an irrational, e.g. Rosenthal, or a reductionist, e.g. Coletti-Narsky, conception of contradiction. It is highly doubtful whether the thesis adopted by Althusser and applied to the problem of the categorical construction of the critique of political economy as a complexly structured whole lacking a homogeneous dynamic of development permits Kosiba to be classified as a German exponent of a structural Marxist interpretation. Behrens and Hofner argue that Kosiba's attempts at methodological reconstruction remain largely unconnected to Althusser's reflections on structural causality. Even Kosiba himself is compelled to concede that Althusser's elaborations on contradiction and overdetermination are difficult to apply to specific questions regarding the exposition of the critique of political economy, It appears that Kosiba remained unaware that just 1 year earlier, Althusser had methodologically expanded his critique of expressive totality, radicalizing into the concept of a diffusion of any explanatory structure within Marx's Capital. A different approach to the problem regarding the relationship between real contradiction and the analytical concept of contradiction can be found in the 1980 work titled Die Reduktion der Dialektik durch Marx, The Reduction of Dialectic by Marx. Here, Gerhard Güler distinguishes two extremes in the conception of dialectic, specifically with regard to Marx's mode of presentation, which, however, are intended merely to reflect two concepts of dialectic already present in Marx himself, a quote emphatic one and a reduced one, Within the framework of the former, the quote structural interconnections, unquote, of the subject matter are quote theoretically reproduced by being translated into a sequence necessitated by thought and are thereby recognized in their law-like nature, end quote. The inner necessary connection between successive categories is established through transitions that are intended to possess, quote, not merely a transitional character, end quote, in the didactic sense, but which, without being capable of being understood as a direct reflection of reality, must instead be, quote, grounded in the subject matter itself, end quote. In this paradigm of scientific grounding, contradiction serves as the driving force propelled by the category's immanent tendency to transcend themselves. At every level of presentation, Güler argues contradictions emerge that would, quote, annihilate the described elements and prevent the interconnection of their determinations from ever coming into being in the first place, end quote. A conceptual presentation that can neither interpret these contradictions as fictitious nor leave them theoretically unresolved in this manner is then directed toward forms of motion or, quote, chiastic structures of mediation, quote, within whose structure they provisionally find stability, end quote. Within the framework of a reduced dialectic, the sequence of concepts is, quote, no longer the immanent orientation of development, driven forward by the determination of the subject matter itself, end quote, but rather results, quote, from the selection of possible steps in accordance with the objective dictated by the subject matter of this development, end quote. In this context, contradiction is either avoided entirely or at the very least forfeits its function as the element driving the presentation forward. It is reduced to a, quote, descriptive type of contradiction. From a historical perspective, the first form of dialectical exposition can be situated in Critique, Marx's initial attempt to derive the development of money from the, quote, actual interrelation of commodities within the level of abstraction of the exchange process. Here, ultimately, in vain, an attempt is made to explain both money and the structure of the exchange process simultaneously, thereby laying claim to the, quote, emphatic program of the immanent development of the determinations of wealth forms out of a process itself. Indeed, in Critique, the general equivalent is derived solely from the exchange process. Yet even at this stage, albeit not in the same manner as in Capital, one encounters a separation in the exposition between the, quote, theoretical conceptual, end quote, and the actual relationships of commodities to one another, a distinction that calls Güler's reconstruction into question at this very point. Consequently, he is compelled to postulate that for this distinction, quote, a systematic function, is not discernible, end quote, in order to uphold his thesis regarding a, quote, Marxian, quote, emphatic dialectical claim. A, quote, Marxian, quote, emphatic dialectical, end quote, claim, end quote. In the second edition of Capital, Marx is said to have severed the joint development of money, emerging from the polarity relation of the value forms, which Guler terms the quote, exchange relation, or quote, halved exchange structure, end quote. And the structure of the exchange process is a money-mediated equivalence relation. Here, money in the guise of the quote money form is allegedly derived within the analysis of value forms, appearing already within the quote theoretical conceptual end quote, or quote halved relationship of commodities to one another. For this reason, the residual explanation of money, derived from the actual commodity relation within the exchange process, can, according to Guler, be understood only as quote a relic remaining within the revision end quote. This modified version of the theory of money, he argues, no longer exhibits, quote, any development of contradictions, end quote, and initially at least avoids logical inconsistencies. However, the fundamental problem, one that already characterized the, quote, emphatic attempt at solution, namely, quote, how the equivalence relation of the exchange structure, end quote, parenthesis, or in Guler's terminology, the, quote, exchange process, end quote, in parenthesis, quote, can be constituted only through the non-equivalences within the structure of the value form, end quote. Parenthesis, the quote halved exchange structure, end quote, in parenthesis, remains present even in this quote reduced variant of dialectical exposition, thereby leading it into a logical contradiction. This construction of logical contradiction, arising from both the quote explicative emphatic, end quote, and the quote descriptive reduced, end quote, conceptions of dialectics, will be examined in greater detail in the context of Dieter Wolff's critique of Guler. At the same time, this calls into question those critiques of dialectics that rely on Guler's distinction and seek to push it further in the direction of analytical positions. That Guler, in his assessment of the various variants of value form and money analysis in Marx, and particularly on their interrelationship, is pursuing a false trail will become evident in the detailed reconstruction of the debate surrounding the integration of the money form into the analysis of the value form in Marx's Capital. By demonstrating the substantive necessity of conceptually separating the explanation of the value form from that of money within the framework of a dialectical materialist exposition of forms of wealth, understood here as, quote, materialism of the second nature, end quote, that accounts for social processes of alienation involving the relegation of human beings to the, quote, environment of a system of form generation. Those approaches implicitly oriented towards Guler will also be subjected to critique, specifically those approaches such as that of Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt in 1995 that lament a, quote, hardening of monetary value theory in Marx's Capital into three separate chapters. In his work titled Ware und Geld, Money and Commodity, first published in 1985, Dieter Wolff set out to elucidate, quote, the rational character of materialist dialectics, end quote, through a meticulous reconstruction of Marx's exposition in the first three chapters of Capital. Wolff conceives of the contradictory structure of the critique of political economy as the realization of the methodological program articulated in the Grundrisse. Consequently, he identifies, quote, the inner necessity of their belonging together and their indifferent independent existence vis-a-vis one another, end quote, as the constitutive determinants of a dialectical contradiction. For Wolff, this contradiction qualifies as rational under two conditions. One, quote, the forms of motion of the contradiction entail the mediation of the extremes without these being conflated with one another, end quote. And two, quote, the forms of motion entail the, quote, decisiveness of real opposites, their formation into extremes, their ignition into a decisive struggle. End quote. In short, crisis. The contradiction thus persists within its forms of resolution or motion, forms which Wolff conceptualizes as extramental, quote, problem-solving structures, end quote, that enable the unfolding of contradictions within production relations characterized by private divisions of labor. Wolff argues that these criteria for a scientific mode of exposition, one that operates within and through contradictions, are violated in the contributions of Coletti, Fulda, and Guler. Coletti is charged with 4 central errors. 1. The conflation of appearance and essence. 2. The splitting of economic objects into 2 disparate realities. 3. An artificial separation between real opposition and dialectical contradiction. And consequently, 4. The construction of a logical contradiction between use value and value. Wolff identifies the foundation for all 4 of these aspects in the fact that Coletti turns, quote, the capital relation, ... into a distinct reality, end quote, one which by virtue of the alienation prevailing within it is, quote, thoroughly irrational, end quote. According to Wolff, this occurs firstly through the positing of a, quote, false alternative, either as Coletti would have it, the, quote, crazy forms are mere products of political economy's flawed understanding of capitalism, or they designate the, quote, manner in which capitalist reality itself presents itself, end quote. Thereby, however, he does not mean an objectively grounded appearance, but rather an irrational identity of appearance and reality. Secondly, Coletti makes nature the, quote, standard for the reality that constitutes the object of science, end quote. It is in this sense, Wolff argues, that Coletti interprets Marx's references to the, quote, natural laws of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. However, according to Wolff, this turn of phrase has nothing to do with, quote, equating laws in nature with laws in society, end quote. As Coletti correctly observes, though he reserves this insight for a distinct secondary reality, the objectivity of capital is not natural, but rather, quote, alienation. This is the subject addressed by the, quote, philosopher Marx. The, quote, scientist Marx, however, if one follows Coletti, must then be entirely abstracted from the historically specific formal determinations of the capitalist mode of production, defining his object instead as a mode of production in general. Coletti's treatment of money serves as an exemplary instance of this bifurcation of the reality of economic forms. Coletti posits that Ricardo's money, the, quote, countable, is something entirely distinct from Marx's money, the, quote, god of alienation, end quote. According to Wolff, while the theoretical objects of the 2 thinkers are indeed distinct, precisely because Ricardo lacks a concept of money, both money as a measure of value and its characterization as a reified autonomous social relation must be theoretically derived from the very same source, the, quote, commodity form of the products of labor, end quote, which these products assume under specific conditions. Thus, in an adequate theoretical reproduction of economic reality, Wolff argues, both dimensions of money are to be found. This implies that both attributes can only be adequately developed and understood in their interrelation at the level of Marx's critique. In Coletti's view, however, money as a measure represents an orientation toward the measuring natural sciences, whereas money as alienation represents an orientation toward a speculative philosophy that traffics in irrational objects. Finally and thirdly, he assigns to this separation a character defined by, quote, Finally and thirdly, he assigns this separation a character defined by real opposition and dialectical contradiction. Thus, while he is indeed correct in asserting that the fundamental contradiction of capitalism lies between use value and value, specifically between private labor that must manifest itself as social labor, he errs in his approach when he unmediatedly juxtaposes, quote, real opposition and, quote, contrast against, quote, contradiction. For although, quote, use, value, and value, as distinct modes of existence of social labor, constitute distinct existences of one and the same essence, they have, by virtue of the objectivity of value, i.e. by virtue of abstract human labor manifesting itself in objective form, acquired the character of a real opposition, end quote. Coletti, by contrast, conceives of the real opposition between commodity and money as the, quote, externally appearing form of an internal, visible, and for Coletti, therefore, unreal interconnection, end quote. Wolff. He attempts to explain the separation and unity of use value and value solely through the lens of crisis. According to Wolff, however, both these movements are already present prior to the crisis, existing as independent opposing modes of existence of commodity and money, which simultaneously present the dynamic form of the contradiction between use value and value, as well as their intrinsic interdependence. Consequently, to the scientific observer, the internal necessary interconnection between commodity and money reveals itself even before its violent assertion during a crisis. For, absent a relation to commodities, money ceases to function as an expression of value. It is then no longer the objective mode of existence of value, but regresses to the status of a mere use value, metal, paper, etc. And similarly, without commodities relating to one another as values, mediated through money as their common form of value, commodities too would regress to the status of mere products. Thus, commodities and money truly exist only in the form of the mutual autonomization of entities that are simultaneously intrinsically connected. By identifying the autonomy of these extremes with their absolutely indifferent opposition to one another, Coletti therefore simply fails to grasp any economic social form determination of the products of labor. What he conceives as a, quote, real opposition, lacking any inner unity within the relationship between commodity and money, is, in fact, merely a moment of the absolutization of their separation during a crisis, a situation in which, quote, each extreme must preserve itself as what it is, without reference to the other, end quote. Where commodities and money, in their autonomy vis-a-vis one another, truly, quote, real opposites, end quote, devoid of any possibility of mediation, quote, then both would cease to be themselves, end quote. Through the absolutization of their separation during a crisis, so argues Wolff, precisely this tends to occur, reaching a point where their indelible mutual interdependence violently reasserts itself, yet, in doing so, it is only their absolutized separation, and not their separateness per se that is sublated. Coletti, conversely, owing to his reductionist perspective on the crisis, posits a reciprocal autonomy between commodity and money, quote, that brings ruin upon both, end quote, while simultaneously misinterpreting the violent re-establishment of commodity and money's unity as the sublation of their separateness. The specific mode of their intrinsic connection and separateness thus eludes Coletti. For what Coletti regards as, quote, real, only insofar as it exists in absolute separation from its counterpart. Let me repeat that. The specific mode of the intrinsic connection and separateness thus eludes Coletti. For what he regards as, quote, real, only insofar as it exists in absolute separation from its counterpart, Marx, in the specific case of commodities and money, would regard as precisely that which can no longer be considered to possess a truly real existence. According to Coletti, the particularly irrational reality of the objects of the critique of political economy is ultimately characterized by the fact that commodities and money have become, quote, things in reality, end quote, even though, quote, they are not things, end quote. In doing so, Coletti constructs a logical contradiction by asserting, regarding the very same object and in the very same respect, that it possesses both the property of, quote, being a thing, end quote, and the exact opposite of that property. This would amount to claiming, with respect to the aspect in which commodities and money are things, namely their use value, that they constitute use value and simultaneously non-use value, i.e. value. However, Wolff argues, the commodity does not exist in this manner as a unity of these two determinations, in a way that, quote, mystically and irrationally, end quote, conflates use value and value. Rather, in the context of exchange, commodities are, quote, related to one another in two distinct respects, end quote. Consequently, no logical contradiction exists between use value and value. Products acquire the property of, quote, value only within a specific social context, whereas their use value is something they possess even outside the sphere of exchange. When Coletti speaks of commodities and money becoming real as things, this is, from Wolff's perspective, absurd, because in their use value form, commodities are already always real things. At most, if rightly understood, it is the value dimension of commodities that becomes real as a thing, within the use value dimension of money. Yet this occurs not in the sense of its use value becoming value, but rather in the sense of the objective representation of something non-objective, that is, of functioning as something that is not itself directly. Thus here too, according to Wolff, no logical contradiction is to be found. Wolff continues his critique of irrational reconstructions of Marxian theory by examining the example of Gerhard Güler. According to Wolff, Güler's assertion that the separation of value form analysis from exchange according to Wolff, Güler's assertion that the separation of value form analysis from exchange analysis results in the suspension of the immanent dynamics of contradiction within the development of the value form of capital rests first and foremost simply on the disregard of central textual evidence in Marx's work. This omission of the development from an internal to an external opposition subsequently leads to a reductive conception of the category of contradiction, inasmuch as Güler fails to review the external polar opposition of the value form in connection with, and as a result of, the internal contradictory structure of the commodity per se. For Wolff, it is precisely this nexus, this simultaneous interplay of internal cohesion and a divergent striving toward the polar distribution of opposing elements into external forms of motion, that constitutes the defining characteristic of dialectical contradictions. While the linguistic expression of these contradictions may indeed assume contradictory forms, even in the case of the opposition immanent to the commodity, that between use value and value, it is completely misconstrued if it is taken to mean that a given state of affairs is simultaneously affirmed alongside its opposite, end quote. Wolff. While Wolff already regards Güler's thesis concerning the avoidance of an imminent, explicative dynamic of contradiction within Marx's capital as misguided, Wolff interprets Güler's diagnosis of an ultimately logically contradictory argumentative structure in the chapter on the exchange process as a projection of irrational views onto Marx's text. Wolff argues that Güler's complex procedure for reinterpreting Marx's theory of value begins with a denial of the fact that the polarity relationship inherent in the value form implies, in a logically non-contradictory manner, the equivalence relationship of the commodities involved, which stand in an asymmetrical relation to one another, whereby only one commodity expresses its value, while the other thing serves as the expression of that value. Instead, Wolff contends that Güler unwittingly conceives of the value form in a logically contradictory manner, although Güler initially correctly observes that, in the simple value form, the value of commodity A is expressed as exchange value, within the use value of commodity B. He subsequently misidentifies the actual state of affairs, namely that the use value of B functions as the value of commodity A within the value relation, as a simple equation of the use value of B with the value of A. Quote, "It is not commodity A as such," Guler writes, quote, "that can be equated with commodity B as such, nor is it the use value of commodity A with the use value of commodity B, but rather the exchange value of A, parenthesis, abstracted from its use value, and parenthesis, that is equated with the use value of B," end quote. Guler, quote, "Thus the commodity, qua commodity, duplicates its form by equating a use value with itself as an equivalent," end quote. In this manner, Wolff concludes, Guler transforms the value form into a, quote, "linear equation of value, that of A with use value, that of B, quote, single linear, or, quote, unidirectionally oriented," end quote. This is the case, and for him, this simultaneously serves as an argument against the symmetry, parenthesis, i.e. equivalence, end parenthesis, of the value form relation, because the use value of commodity B, in which the value of commodity A is expressed, is not itself in turn expressed by that value. According to Wolff, Guler thus grasps neither the value form nor the relation of value equality, since an equation of values and use values never actually takes place, neither, quote, single linearly, end quote, Guler's value form, or, quote, reflexively, Guler's symmetry criterion. In the value form, however, the value of commodity A is, quote, equated with the use value of another commodity only insofar as the use value of B, quote, is itself value, concealed behind its material shell, end quote. The use value of B thus counts here as that which is equal to the first commodity, and it does so not as a use value, but solely as value. The use value serves as the tangible form of A, quote, as something equal to the value of the linen. The use value of the coat commodity cannot be use value, end quote. It, quote, counts ... as something that immediately it is not, end quote. This complex social relation of validity, which attaches itself to objects, is thus in Guler's hands transformed into a mystical objectivity. The equivalence relation, which he had hitherto completely disregarded, he now derives from the combination of the simple value form with its inversion. The value of A is thereby represented in the use value of B, and the value of B in the use value of A. Only at this point, according to Guler, is the, quote, exchange structure established. He attempts thereby to establish a relation of equality out of the two value forms. He attempts thereby to establish a relation of equality out of two value forms, conceived as relations of non-equivalence, which amounts to nothing other than grounding this equality not in the actual equation of commodities as values, but rather in the shared attribute of commodities of serving as forms of appearance of value. He attempts, quote, to explain the equality of commodities as values by positing that it is common to distinct use values to appear. In the value expression of another commodity as a form of appearance of value, end quote. However, disregarding the underlying equivalence relation, a relation of equality cannot subsequently be constructed from the combination of the polar relations of two value forms, precisely because use values do not, by virtue of their function within these value forms, mutate into values. Proceeding from such premises, which are themselves paradoxical, it becomes an easy matter for Guler to regard the foundational structure of the exchange process as something that cannot be logically represented. Get out of here. Wolff levels the charge against Hans Friedrich Fulda that he conflates the defining features of the Hegelian speculative contradiction with Marx's concept of a, quote, real opposition, a concept explicated in Marx's early writings. According to Wolff, Fulda posits the symmetry of extremes as a characteristic of the speculative mode of argument of spot. Let me repeat that whole thing. Wolff levels the charge against Hans Friedrich Fulda that he conflates the defining features of the Hegelian speculative contradiction with Marx's concept of a, quote, real opposition, a concept explicated in Marx's early writings. According to Wolff, Fulda posits the symmetry of extremes as a characteristic of the speculative model of mediation, and the, quote, overreaching of one extreme as a characteristic of a real opposition. Wolff argues conversely that Marx, against the backdrop of his critique of Hegel's idealist conception of contradiction, in which absolute spirit is conceived as a, quote, third term, transcending the opposition between finite spirit and nature, a third term consisting of one side of the contradiction that transcends both itself and its opposite, still understands, quote, mediation exclusively as a mystical conflation of extremes, whereas he accepts only the opposition consisting of irreconcilable extremes as a, quote, real opposition. However, Wolff notes that this model of mediation is later adapted in Marx's Capital in a non-idealist manner. In this context, the opposition between concrete and abstract labor can be understood as a, quote, difference within the existence of an essence, end quote, an opposition mediated within a third term, which only develops into a, quote, real opposition under capitalism when abstract labor constitutes the social form of concrete labors and as a specific determination acquires a real independence of its own. According to Wolff, use value and value can thus be defined as a, quote, difference within the existence of an entity, end quote, a difference which, at the same time, quote, possesses the character of a real opposition, end quote. It is a, quote, difference within the existence of an entity, end quote, because it is one and the same labor that, under capitalism, is determined in distinct and opposing ways. They become a, quote, real opposition, end quote, under the conditions of a production system characterized by a private division of labor. According to Wolff, the distinction between concrete and abstract labor does indeed exist in all social formations, either as a property of all concrete labors, namely that of being human labor per se, conceptually fixed by a theoretical observer, or as a relationship of concrete labors to one another, qua abstract labors, in the context of the proportional distribution of total social labor. However, it is only within generalized production relations based on a private division of labor that abstract labor acquires the function of serving as the socially general form of concrete labors. Thereby, abstract labor is endowed with an autonomy that otherwise, quote, belongs only to the social nexus distinct from it, end quote, and concrete and abstract labor ultimately come to be distinguished from one another, quote, like two distinct entities, end quote. Thus, while the social nexus, e.g. of web of norms and coercion, always exists a priori as something autonomous vis-a-vis concrete labors, abstract labor as a specific form of social synthesis must first establish its autonomy vis-a-vis concrete labors. That is, quote, in the autonomy it has acquired through its socially general character, it must exist as independently as if it were a second kind of labor, even though it is no such thing, end quote. The specific manner in which it exists autonomously is determined by the ex post facto relation of labors to one another through the exchange of their products. Within the value form, use value and value, material content and social form, exist as distinct qualities, quote, independently of one another and in the same autonomous manner in the form of two mutually distinct use values, end quote. At the outset of the exposition, they appear as initially unmediated, quote, real extremes, they have, quote, nothing in common with one another, end quote. As concrete, material, and abstract social entities, they are of absolutely different quality. For value contains, quote, not a single atom of natural matter, end quote. They, quote, do not demand one another, end quote. While it is true that concrete labor and social interconnection are constitutively mutually referential, this does not necessarily apply to concrete labor and social unity in the guise of abstract labor. This opposition, it is argued, entails the, quote, equal standing of the extremes, end quote. However, as evidence for this symmetry, Wolff cites precisely that passage from the second chapter of Marx's Capital, in which commodities must realize themselves as values before they can realize themselves as use values, and vice versa, which had previously served him as the criterion for the internally necessary connection of use value and value. As the engagement with Coletti and Guler has already demonstrated, it is Wolff's endeavor to fundamentally distinguish the dimension of unity between use value and value, both within the, quote, commodity in itself, end quote, and within the value form, from a, quote, mystical, irrational, and, quote, conflation of these two extremes, which transfigures the commodity into a logical contradiction and constitutes precisely the fetishism criticized by Marx. To begin with, Wolff regards value itself as the social dimension of unity inherent in privately produced goods. Goods produced in isolation from one another are related to one another in those goods' value dimension, and thus socialized by being treated as commodities. That is, by, quote, abstracting from those products' use values and, quote, reducing them to products of abstract labor. This must be distinguished from the commodity considered as a unity of use value and value, a unity which initially merely signifies the unmediated coexistence of two distinct determinations, one material and one social, within the same object. As a unity of use value and value, a commodity can only manifest itself in relation to other commodities. Through this representation of the value of commodity A in the use value of B, there now emerges a, quote, unification, a, quote, unification, end quote, of the value of the first commodity with the use value of the second, end quote. A unification that must be distinguished from the property possessed by each commodity individually, considered as a unity of use value and value in its own right. In this relationship, the natural form of B serves as the value form of A. In this process, neither is the value of A transformed into the use value of B, nor is the use value of B transformed into the value of A. Such a transformation would constitute precisely the commodity fetish, a phenomenon in which a social function, which accrues to a commodity only within a historically specific relationship, as a determination of reflection, in parentheses, appears instead as a natural property inherent in the commodity itself. The, quote, relation of representation, end quote, in which the use value of B, or more precisely the concrete private labor expended therein, functions as the form of appearance of its opposite, value, or more precisely, abstract social labor, is not to be conceived as an equation or fusion of use value and value, as a multitude of Marxist and non-Marxist interpreters have assumed. There, quote, exists no ontological identity, end quote, between these determinations. While Wolff's focus on the substantive content of the critique of political economy is achieved at the cost of a lack of metatheoretical explication, specifically the general relationship between logical and dialectical contradictions, or whether distinct types of contradiction exist within Marx's work, remains unaddressed. Wolff nevertheless succeeds, drawing closely upon the material exposition in Marx's Capital, in explicating the concept of contradiction as a dialectical rather than a logical one. In doing so, he critically corrects a specific problematic characteristic of the Hegelian Marxist discourse, not only in the Federal Republic. Dialectical thought not infrequently implies an emphatic distinction between Verstand, or understanding, and Vernunft, or reason. Thinking based on Verstand, understanding, is defined as that which halts at unmediated opposites and reifies them, thus recognizing only, quote, real oppositions, unquote. Whereas thinking based on Vernunft, or reason, is defined as that which, in addition, takes into account their mediations, unity or interconnections. In this regard, Wolff's work demonstrates that the crucial factor is how the concept of mediation, unity or interconnection is understood. This appears to be the core of the question regarding the extent to which the subject matter of Marx's Capital is rationally, in the sense of vernünftig, reasonable/rational, comprehensible. In Marxian dialectic, if one follows Wolff's reconstruction, a specific type of rationality is present. One that conceives of internal mediations while simultaneously insisting upon, quote, enduring differences within the mediation, quote, thereby distinguishing itself from, quote, wooden irons, or entities that are simultaneously and in the very same respect both social and non-social. One second. Okay. Helmut Brentel's 1989 contribution marks a provisional conclusion to the reflections broadly oriented toward Hegel concerning the status of dialectical exposition. As in the case of Wolff, central substantive aspects of the methodological debate, such as the critique of pre-monetary value theory, will initially be set aside and treated in detail only in the subsequent chapter on the object of critique, even if this necessarily entails accepting a certain degree of redundancy. Following Helmut Brentel, Marx conceives of his object of a materially mediated social relation, objectified value, which in the fundamental patterns of economic conceptualization is systematically overlooked, possesses, quote, objective properties, unquote, yet, quote, exists solely as a social relation, unquote. Marx's analysis of form, functioning as both a theory of the form of labor and a fetish theory of consciousness, lays claims to the task of, quote, genetically reconstructing the constitution of socioeconomic forms from their antagonistic foundational relations, and in doing so, deconstructing both the systematic underdeterminations and the fetishisms inherent in economic concept formation. In this context, the development of form is provisionally defined as the recovery of the necessary, quote, social presuppositions, unquote, underlying seemingly simple phenomena. In this process, the, quote, characteristic determinations, unquote, of these phenomena reveal, quote, traces of their, quote, essential logical difference, unquote. That is, they point beyond their own merely unmediated, quote, being toward their mediation through their, quote, essence, thereby presenting themselves as deficient, inadequate, and dependent categories. According to Brentel, the categories at the beginning of the exposition are merely abstractions from the overarching context of capitalist relations of production that constitutes them. The commodity and the value form found at the outset are, and have always already been, actual moments of the capital form, from which, however, one must still methodologically abstract. In this sense, Marx's abstractions are underdetermined. They require further specification in light of their constitutive interconnections and must ultimately be demonstrated to be determined, fully specified. Such a, quote, stepwise dissolution and retraction of abstractions, and, quote, entails a contextualization of forms of wealth, one directed against the erroneous, quote, positivization and isolation of formal moments, end quote, that does not begin with a transhistorical general concept of the commodity, which is then only successively specified in historical terms. Yet the categories of political economy, in turn, abstract from the character of these simple forms as mere moments, and from their specific formal determinations, thereby conceptualizing the beginning in a manner that is, quote, badly abstract, end quote. According to Brentel, however, the initial abstractions of Marx's critique specifically concern economic objectivity as, quote, it presents itself within the horizon of political economy, end quote. For categories such as the, quote, collection of commodities, end quote, the commodity as a useful thing possessing an exchange value, or exchange value as a quantitative ratio of use values, this may well hold true. Here Brentel's observation that the concept of exchange value is, quote, initially introduced in Marx's Capital, precisely as it is defined in the theory of political economy, by Barbin, that might be a misspelling, I don't know, or Bailey, that is, subjectivistically or relativistically, end quote. It is crucial to correcting the erroneous understanding of the concept of the commodity's, quote, concreteness. So I fucked that up. Let me repeat that whole sentence. Here, Brentel's observation that the concept of exchange value is, quote, initially introduced in Marx's Capital, precisely as it is defined in the theory of political economy by Barbin or Bailey, that is, subjectivistically or relativistically, end quote, is crucial for correcting the erroneous understanding of the concept of the commodity's concreteness itself, an understanding so emphatically championed by historicist positions. And there's a very good article, and I think there's multiple articles on this about the influence of Bailey on Marx's value theory, which kind of allowed him, kind of like shook him, I think, more or less. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing this, but I have it in my head. It's kind of like shaken from his dogmatic slumber, as David Hume's empiricism shook Kant of his dogmatic metaphysics, right? How he characterizes it. But I think there's a degree to which, in my memories of the articles that I have read, it's a degree to which, like, Bailey emphasizes the relativity of exchange value. It has like a highly empiricist view. To my understanding of value is like sheerly the relationship of things between like supply and demand, or like there's no kind of essence beyond the appearance of exchange, I guess. And so this makes Marx, I think, a little more sensitive to the relationship between essence and appearance, right? That value like must necessarily be represented in exchange value, and that socially necessary abstract labor time is a changing changing quantity, something like that. I'm representing it poorly, but something to that effect. Quote, the commodity as the PEM, and I forget what that stands for again, already points out, is, quote, concrete in the sense of being a, quote, summary of many determinations, end quote. It serves as the analytical starting point of the exposition, subsequently broken down into use value and value. It is a concrete entity from which abstractions are made. Yet according to the logic of Marx's Grundrisse, this concrete entity is not an empirical datum accessible to everyday consciousness. Rather, as a commodity not yet defined by price, it remains in itself a theoretical abstraction. Thus, when Marx states that he initially analyzes the commodity, quote, in the form in which it appears, unquote, namely as both use value and exchange value, understood as a quantitative ratio of use values, this statement is, in a strict sense, incorrect. Brentel's arguments prove helpful here, for in his view the equation of, quote, commodity equals commodity, i.e. exchange value, takes place in reality only as an equation between commodity and money. Exchange value, as understood in chapter 1.1 of Marx's Capital, is thus revealed to be, in itself, a product of the very abstractions inherent in political economy. However, it is not unimportant to mention that, through his choice of words, Marx already draws attention to the illusory character of that initial determination of exchange value, using phrases such as, quote, appears initially, or, quote, therefore seems, and immediately therefore examines, quote, the matter more closely, unquote, and sets the record straight. Brentel now asserts that Marx consciously employs this very procedure with regard to the determination of the value substance, abstract labor. The argument is that Marx initially recurs here to the substantialist labor theories of value found in the works of figures like Ricardo or Proudhon, only to subsequently demonstrate the historicity and purely social specificity of this, quote, substance. Yet it remains unclear why, during the, quote, introduction of the reified political economic definition of value substance in chapter 1.2, Marx writes, quote, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and in this quality it forms the value of commodities, unquote, rather than stating, quote, all labor seems, unquote. And why, furthermore, without any reference to that earlier passage, he presents a non-naturalistic determination only many pages later. For a, quote, consciously thematized and provoked misunderstanding, unquote, this sequence of events appears, after all, a bit too coincidental. In any case, and to this extent one must agree with Brentel, form analysis implies a, quote, theory of appearance, unquote, the objects of which are initially, quote, objects of consciousness, unquote, namely the conceptions held by everyday actors, as well as the systematizations of these conceptions undertaken by political economy. However, these conceptions are deciphered as, quote, systematic illusion, unquote. Thus, forms of social wealth invariably appear to actors as, quote, thing-like and volumetric, unquote. That is, in an objective guise, taking the form of manifestations of value that are not as such recognized as such. These manifestations, acting as the surface of the overall social nexus, constitute a real moment of the whole. It is only when perceived without reference to their underlying context of constitution and interrelation that such perceptions become false. According to Brentel, however, the Marxian mode of presentation inherently entails a quasi-essential logical, quote, consciousness of difference, unquote, regarding the categories of the beginning. For Marx, these categories constitute merely the, quote, most abstract expression of developed capitalist relations, unquote, and possesses a, quote, far-reaching significance, unquote. Yet according to Brentel, the awareness of this relation is the totality constitutes. Yet according to Brentel, the awareness of this relation to the totality constitutes an anticipation, just as this anticipation is implicitly necessary to avoid a concretistic misunderstanding of the simple categories, so too is the abstraction from the constitutive, complex overall context explicitly necessary for the purpose of systematically explaining complex, empirically given forms of wealth. Quote, Marx's preliminary determinations of the object which contain substantive prior knowledge regarding the overall context, must navigate a fundamental difficulty while analyzing in greater depth the formal determinations that appear at the outset. They must not employ, for the further determinations of these forms, any categories that, at this stage of the argumentation, cannot yet have been developed and could. The positive determinations of the object at the beginning must, therefore, undergo, quote, further precision, and could. Otherwise, the determinations become reductionist. On the other hand, these determinations must be employed, otherwise the more complex objects remain inexplicable and are merely grasped in a purely empirical manner. According to Brentel's reconstruction, form analysis functions simultaneously as form critique, the negation of abstractly simple forms insofar as they are posited as presuppositionless, and as form of development, the demonstration of the determinacy of seemingly simple forms by tracing them back, quote, to their broader implications and presuppositions, and quote. The inquiry into the conditions for the autonomy of economic objectivity serves in this context as the, quote, inner secret guiding thread of its progression, quote, whereby symbol categories are exposed, measured against this standard for their inadequacy, specifically, quote, their explanatory deficiency regarding that which is actually to be explained, end quote. To account for the reality of value, successively more complex determinations and presuppositions must be introduced until the ground of its autonomization is discovered. As a fundamental feature of dialectical form development, Brentel thus identifies the further determination of the formal character of social labor, a process that initially entails a regression to its constitutive ground as an independent economic objectivity. In this process, the simple forms are revealed through the discovery of traces of the mediating nexus leading back to the ground as, quote, dependent moments, end quote, of capitalist totality. These traces are held to represent logical implications that are already inherent in the initial categories and are now unfolded, yet cannot be derived from them. Brentel's example is the money commodity money form of simple circulation, from which one can posit, quote, that from the acts of exchange lying within it, commodity purchases and commodity sales, money itself must continuously emerge, and indeed in doing so must establish itself as an independent form, end quote. End quote, Brentel. Accordingly, from the determinations of the undeveloped forms, one can deduce indications regarding the conditions of their positing, conditions that are formulated as, quote, demands placed upon the adequate mode of existence of value. The specific manner in which Brentel sees this procedure substantively realized within the critique of political economy will be the subject of our inquiry in the following chapters concerning the, quote, object of critique. Brentel's reflections culminate initially in the identification of the concept of, quote, transition as a central element of dialectical exposition. According to Brentel, it is primarily around this concept that controversies regarding the understanding of the subject matter and methodology of the critique of political economy ignite. He regards three complexes of questions in particular as contentious. 1. What does, quote, transition signify? A conceptual explication that uncovers structural interconnections, or a theoretical reconstruction of historical sequences? 2. What constitutes the, quote, imminence of the transition? Is it necessarily rooted in a, quote, germ cell metaphor, or does this merely lead to historicizing approaches? 3. What is the dialectical aspect of the transition, and what status is to be ascribed to dialectics as a, quote, method, a historically circumscribed one or a universal one? According to Helmut Brentel, immanent exposition is the explication of that which, in the aforementioned sense, quote, already lies within the concept of form. In this process, more complex categories are not added to the simple ones in a disjointed manner, nor are the latter replaced by the former. Rather, they are unfolded, quote, in their actual meanings, contents, and presuppositions, unquote. The substantive condition of possibility for such a procedure is held to be the systematic character of its object, specifically the constant mediation between, quote, form and content, form and substance, money and labor, end quote. It is solely the fact that the simple forms are already moments of the totality that permits the immanent discovery within those very forms of determinations pointing beyond them. The logical order thus reproduces the factual context of grounding among the forms of wealth, though in Marx's work the intertwining of object and method is not, as it is in Hegel's, grounded in a philosophy of identity. Marx's critique, rather, constitutes an analysis of totality in the sense of explaining a self-referential system, that is, an objectively mediated nexus of action that proceeds from specific conditions of the socialization of labor, structures, and reproduces these, its own presuppositions, as results. The inversion of presupposition into result is a characteristic of totality as a system, a characteristic to which its exposition must also do justice. This system consists of elements that are mutually related and stand in opposition to one another. As such, they are mediated elements, meaning they exist solely through their oppositional relation to one another, determinations of reflection, and are mutually prepositing. The contextualization of these elements within the framework of their necessary mutual interrelatedness is as much a task of dialectical exposition as is the establishment of a conceptual sequence for the purpose of reconstructing this nexus. Thus, in contrast to Hegel, Marx analyzes not an absolute, but a finite system. Consequently, he must view dialectical exposition as practiced in the form of system analysis within its inherent limits, for finite systems possess presuppositions that are not originally posited by the system themselves. Let me repeat that sentence. Thus, in contrast to Hegel, Marx analyzes not an absolute, but a finite system. Consequently, Marx must view dialectical exposition as practiced in the form of system analysis within its inherent limits, for finite systems possess presuppositions that are not originally posited by the systems themselves, but are only subsequently reproduced by them. Brentel thereby aligns himself with Helmut Reichel's thesis of dialectic as a, quote, method on revocable terms, end quote. Where am I? Okay. Well, Brentel characterizes Marx's method as immanent. Knowledge of the form's implications is, according to him, quote, prior knowledge resulting from the research process, unquote. Transitions, even as they trace substantive connections, are, he argues, always to some extent constructed by the theorist who already possesses knowledge of the whole. Thus neither is pure immanence possible, as Gerhard Güler or Dieter Riedel postulated to be an indispensable condition for dialectical exposition, nor is the sequence of categories owed solely to didactic considerations, as Hellberger and others maintain. In doing so and building upon earlier reflections by Jürgen Ritzert, Brentel attempts to develop a third position situated between the alternative modes of exposition posited by Hegel, that of, quote, mere observation versus, quote, external addition, unquote. According to Brentel, all this precludes a realistic understanding of Marx's, quote, germ cell metaphor, the view that money and capital emerge from the commodity just as a tree emerges from a germ. Quote, to interpret Marx as a, quote, germ cell dialectician, end quote, in this sense would, however, amount to inverting the very impetus of his critique of the economic conception of the object, end quote. Consequently, the concept of the development of forms in Marx is to be understood neither in an, quote, idealist generative, end quote, sense, nor in a, quote, real historical, end quote, sense, but, quote, solely in terms of the form-critical reconstruction of a self-referential social process, end quote. Marx by no means intends to trace the historically empirical emergence of the complex from the simple. Rather, his aim is the conceptual, quote, unfolding of the real complex presuppositions underlying that which appears simple. Thus the notion that the more developed form is, quote, contained within the simple form signifies merely the simple form's character as a moment, one that remains conceptually unfolded in the exposition, functioning as a dependent part of the whole, the simple element of the beginning. The commodity as a, quote, germ cell is thereby revealed to be a theoretical abstraction that nowhere exists empirically in and of itself, in contrast to a germ found in nature. From this perspective, the sequence of categories does not reflect an idealized historical process of real development. Rather, it constitutes a deciphering of the reciprocal relations of determination within a given formal nexus. Drawing upon Michael Heinrich's remarks regarding dialectical presentation as a form of scientific grounding, the key point of the preceding debate can be synthesized. Heinrich interprets Hegel's dialectic as one of the self-movement of the concept, whereas he views Marx's dialectic as a, quote, nexus of concepts, that process empirical material without, dissolving into merely nominalistic abstractions, unquote. Such conceptual development implies the construction of an order of concepts that express their, quote, essential relations, unquote. This construction is moreover necessitated by the object itself, a system of mutually presupposing forms. In order to explain this system, quote, this mutual presupposition must be conceptually broken open, unquote. To this end, a distinction is drawn between simple and complex categories. The former are to be introduced initially without reference to the latter, even though both exist within a real context of mutual reference. The context of reference manifests itself in the simple categories, which represent theoretical abstractions, as a deficiency or indeterminacy that is logically necessary to the mode of presentation. Yet this deficiency, quote, points beyond itself, unquote, thereby providing the transition to a further determination. Thus, a, quote, context of grounding, end quote, emerges between these categories, possessing, quote, specific informational content, end quote. The deficiency of a category signifies the contradiction inherent in its various determinations, a contradiction that necessitates the introduction of a specific new category which, by virtue of its greater complexity, resolves the contradictions of the simpler one. In the reality of bourgeois society, however, these contradictions are, quote, always already, quote, resolved, end quote, unquote. What becomes visible there are merely the results, or rather the empirical manifestations, of internal society-wide interconnections. These consequently present themselves as unmediated, as simply, quote, given. Only the, quote, theoretical construction, end quote, of dialectical presentation can, according to Heinrich, exhibit this semblance of immediacy regarding what is in fact socially mediated. As such, this presentation simultaneously constitutes a critique of mystified conceptions of forms of wealth. According to Heinrich, what dialectical presentation, according to Heinrich, while dialectical presentation, conceived as the establishment of a necessary connection between concepts, does indeed constitute the, quote, conceptual reproduction, end quote, of the, quote, order of the real object, end quote, it is as such explicitly not conceived as an empiricist reflection, a mode that would fall prey precisely to the illusion of the immediacy of forms. Rather, it is a form of insight into the essence of things, understood as the reconstruction of a nexus of social structures and actions that is not immediately accessible to empirical observation. Specifically, the elaboration of, quote, non-empirical conceptual constructs that alone make possible the comprehension of that which appears empirically, unquote. Consequently, neither the individual categories of the internal structure nor their interconnections, transitions, possess, quote, immediate empirical reference, end quote. However, Heinrich appears to be pursuing a purely analytical methodological concept of dialectics only at first glance. For in his view, Hellberger's model theoretic interpretation fails to grasp the very specificity of dialectical presentation, a specificity which, in contrast to purely external or didactic criteria, establishes the real interconnection of concepts precisely through their development. Thus, the laws of bourgeois economy can be grasped only through the, quote, entire sequence of conceptual development, end quote. At the same time, the peculiar circular movement of this presentation serves to capture the systemic character of reproduction inherent in the capitalist mode of production. Heinrich, therefore, certainly proceeds from the premise that the distinctive nature of the method is necessitated by the distinctive nature of the object, and that the ordering of the categories thus reproduces the ordering of the object itself. While the categories pertaining to the level of essence are indeed non-empirical, they are by no means, on that account alone, merely nominalistic abstractions. Rather, they represent a conceptual grasp of real generalities. What conclusions can be drawn from this brief excursion into the methodological debate surrounding a concept of dialectics viable for social theory? To begin with, several theses of the analytical perspective can certainly lay claim to plausibility. For instance, the much-cited, quote, ascent from the abstract to the concrete, unquote, which Marx regards as, quote, the scientifically correct method, unquote, for analyzing bourgeois society does not, in fact, constitute a break with the traditional understanding of method that has been prevalent since Descartes. Even the introduction of more complex categories by means of a, quote, development of contradictions, unquote, a strategy fundamental to the mode of presentation, is, as Steinfort's contribution demonstrates, translatable into deductive nomological terms. However, the problems inherent in the analytical approach lie concealed within the model theoretic interpretation encountered here, an interpretation that ultimately reduces dialectical constructions of the interconnections between categories to, quote, third and fourth rate, end quote, didactic questions regarding the cognitively pedagogical task of guiding the reader toward realistic patterns of interpretation. Ultimately, this approach betrays a nominalist background that fails to do justice to Marx's claim that dialectical presentation serves to reveal the interconnections between economic forms. A faint echo of this view can still be found in Steinfort, who speaks of, quote, non-real contradictions. Furthermore, premises such as methodological individualism, explicitly found in Popper, but also in a diluted form as action-theoretic reductionism, still shaping Steinfort's attempt at reconstruction, stand in profound contradiction to Marxian thought. This approach conceives of society not as consisting, quote, of individuals, end quote, but rather as a structured whole of objectively mediated, quote, relations and conditions in which these individuals stand to one another, end quote. Furthermore, it interprets the trajectory of the exposition in Capital as an adequate reconstruction of a form of socialization in which human actions are determined by structures that remain opaque to and beyond the control of the actors themselves. Structures which, of course, are nonetheless continually reproduced through those very actions. The structural, anonymous, coercive order of capitalism, in which individuals and collectives are, quote, dominated by abstractions, end quote, can no more be grasped through one-sided action-theoretical models or methodological individualism than can the historical specificity of the action logics of actors subject to market imperatives. Finally, it can be shown that alternative conceptions of dialectics need not be, quote, Hegel-Marxist in the sense of a philosophy of identity. Meta-theoretically, however, the relationship to the deductively nomological research program has not yet been sufficiently clarified. Yet one will not get very far by brandishing the ideologically charged, quote, positivism cudgel, end quote, a practice that was particularly fashionable among the self-styled, quote, critical academic left, especially during the 1970s. Okay, and that is the end of Chapter 2 of Part 1 of Marx in the West. Where am I? Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Chapter 2 of the book of Part 1 is titled Logical, Historical, Dialectical, a departure from the methodological tradition and debates on the specificity of the Marxian method. And this particular section of it, Section 2 of Chapter 2, titled Operative Dialectic or Presentation and Contradictions, had the headings 1. Marxian dialectic from the perspective of analytical positions, and 2. The peculiar logic of a peculiar object. The next section is titled Excursus on the Research Process. Thank you so much for listening.